I'd like to welcome Dr. Sarah Onida. She's a consultant vascular surgeon and honorary senior lecturer in the vascular surgery department in the Imperial College of London. She has over 100 publications over just 13 years and is a worldwide lecturer and fluent in 5 languages. She's truly one of the rising stars in venous disease. Thank you for agreeing to this podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here today.
So VLUs is something that's increasing worldwide. We're seeing more patients who are older, we're seeing more patients who have increased obesity, and that's the perfect storm for VLUs. This is an exciting time for VLUs. Can you talk about some of your work that you've been looking at for treating and diagnosing these patients?
Absolutely. So it might be helpful for me to share some slides, which I have here, just to illustrate some of these points. And I hope that that is being displayed appropriately there. So you're absolutely right. I think that VLU population is the population of our patients that needs the most care. They have the most extreme presentation of venous disease. And yet they're the ones whose outcomes perhaps are not as good as everyone else's. The healing and the recurrence rates are still presenting an issue, despite really good evidence supporting intervention in these patients and compression. But actually, particularly for certain subgroups of patients, they're very resistant to treatment, and there's still quite a lack of understanding as to why that is. And I think this has been recognized internationally. There have been multiple calls to action. I take the Pacific Vascular Symposium in 2009 that wanted to reduce venous leg ulcer prevalence by 50% in 10 years. And clearly we haven't managed to achieve that. And as you've said, the increasing age and the obesity pandemic will all compound to increase the prevalence of disease. So it's really important for us to find other ways of treating these individuals. And we know from the epidemiology of what has been recorded and coded in venous disease, certainly in England, there hasn't really been a major change in prevalence. We haven't seen a huge increase, but certainly over the last sort of between 2008 and 2018, we haven't seen a real decrease in the prevalence, despite the introduction of national guidelines suggesting that all these individuals should have rapid assessment and treatment of the superficial venous reflux, which is quite concerning. Now, we've relied on really excellent randomized controlled trials over the years, and we have some really good evidence suggesting that intervention in these individuals and compression is really beneficial. But there are some issues with the trials that we have performed, and that goes across the board for both superficial and venous and vascular trials as a whole. Trials take a really long time to set up. They take a really long time to recruit patients. There's a long time to results because you have to follow them up and see their outcomes. And then there's a time, a 6 months period for data analysis. There's a lagged publication. It's very difficult to include novel technologies that may come in very quickly in randomized controlled trials because they're quite a fixed sort of set system. It's not very easy to integrate industry in it often. The infrastructure, once you set it up, tends to work, but setting it up for different trials every time is extremely labor intensive and time consuming. And certainly with COVID, we've had a huge impact on our own randomized controlled trials. And I've certainly had at least one trial that was significantly negatively impacted in terms of recruitment, and that was a venous leg ulcer trial. And I just wanted to spend some time about telling a little bit about platform trials and thinking about different ways as to how we can maximize what we get out of randomized controlled trials. So unlike a single randomized controlled trial that will each recruit a set number of patients and compare an intervention to a control, and you might have 5 different trials, in a platform trial, you have a single control arm. And you're recruiting patients with a certain condition onto this platform. So all patients with venous leg ulcers would therefore be recruited onto this platform. And you could randomize them either to your standardized control arm or to an intervention arm. And the intervention arm can be diverse interventions, so patients can be recruited to different interventions. And what that means is that because you have a single control arm and you just have one big infrastructure, actually it's a lot easier to add arms and remove arms in a more time efficient and cost efficient manner. And on top of that, you can statistically set up ways to identify early futility and early success so that those interventions that are clearly successful from the outset may then be incorporated into your standard care. And those that are clearly not going to work, you recognize them early and then can drop that arm and add another arm. And that avoids having to wait for the, 12-month, 18-month follow-up period before finding out whether something is actually working or not. And what's important is that there's precedent for this. And you might say, well, that's very difficult to do, and you'd need lots of patients. It would need to be international, very difficult to do international studies. But actually, there's clear precedent, particularly with COVID. There's lots of different trials, such as the recovery trial and REMAP-CAP, that have looked at, as basically platform trials in different populations. They've recruited huge numbers of patients, in COVID for recovery, for over 48,000 patients, an international study in over 190 sites. And that can just show that if you have a collaborative approach to research and everybody is invested in recruiting to that trial, you could very quickly get a very large number of patients that you could then provide the opportunity to be randomized to different types of treatments. And another example here is Stampede trial, which again, you can see that over the course of its lifetime, from 2006, and this was going up to 2022, this presentation, but you can see that there have been lots of interventions that have been compared to standard care and therefore created a lot more data that was very helpful to then advance the treatment of these individuals and really having practice-changing results. So in 2023, we obtained funding to set up the first platform infrastructure for a venous leg ulcer trial. And we had never done this in venous leg ulceration or in venous disease. So there was a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of how do you set something like this up, and what would the infrastructure and the governance be to be able to deliver such trials for patients with venous leg ulceration. And what we did was we had 5 work streams, and effectively things that we wanted to do first were, what are the kinds of treatments that exist for patients with venous leg ulceration that have been reported in the literature? They may not have high-level evidence, but what are the ones that have been reported? And at the same time, we needed to find out who should be on this platform trial. What kind of key individuals and members do we need? And we felt that we very much needed clearly patients, expert clinicians, industry members, statisticians, health economists, qualitative experts, data science experts, and trainees as well, to try and get them involved into research in terms of them being then the new generation that will continue performing studies in this area. Following that, we wanted to identify the key performance indicators and platform trial characteristics that were going to be important for the application to then have a finalized trial. We then wanted to discuss with our expert groups and our patients what the consensus would be on an optimal design. And finally, we had to set up a funding application for external peer review. And so this is just a summary of all the 5 different work packages that I mentioned. In terms of governance, this is what we initially set up. So we felt that we wanted to have a specialist advisory group that you can see here has members of all the important teams that we mentioned before. They all feed into the trial methodology periodically with set meetings, with set focus groups. We then had core groups that were meeting on a monthly basis to keep the momentum going. And therefore had some face-to-face meetings as well to discuss what had been discussed with the specialist advisory groups. And then finally, we had an executive group that met on a weekly basis that had the joint lead applicants, the lead statisticians, just to make sure that this was moving forward at an appropriate pace. And these were some of our colleagues that we initially set this up with and are still collaborating with us for the next iteration of this study. Now, when we did the scoping review, so if you remember, work package 1 was looking at all the different types of interventions that have been reported for venous leg ulceration. There is a huge number of them, actually. And certainly in England, in my day-to-day practice, we very much use compression, we very much use intervention, and clearly they receive wound care when they have their dressings changed. But actually, there are many things that we do not use. If we specifically concentrate on the medical management, many of these tablets are not licensed for use in patients with venous leg ulceration because of the lack of high-level evidence to support their use and the cost-effective use in the National Health Service. And although there's quite a lot of lower level evidence, and therefore they are sort of suggested or reported as to be considered in guidelines. There's a real lack of high level evidence, and that's an area that we wanted to concentrate on for the study. So we developed some special interest groups, again, with many of our colleagues who we work with and have a real interest in venous leg ulceration management. And we're very keen to get lots of other individuals involved, particularly on an international stage, so that this could then be successful as an international platform trial. Now, what happened at the end of 2023 is that we then had the application put into the National Institute for Health Research, got through the first stages and finally got to the final stage. But when they had to decide amongst all types of platform trials that had been put in as bids, which included cancer and lots of other types of diseases, sadly, it wasn't funded at the end. But certainly there was a huge amount of work that went into thinking about this project, and actually we're very much discussing about revamping it this year and going for another funding call to have an international platform trial, because I honestly think that in terms of the way we develop our evidence and the way we want the evidence to work for us in terms of how quickly we get it and what information we obtain to translate things to our patients quickly, I really think that this is a model that we have to seriously consider in venous disease, not only in venous leg ulceration, but across the board, especially in such as deep venous disease as well. So I'm hoping that over the next year, we'll be able to revisit this and hopefully then have a collaborative approach with our international colleagues to try and make this a reality, really.
Absolutely. But I also want to highlight something that I didn't hear in your talk about cost savings. I think the platform methodology is actually not only speeds up the results as we found during COVID, because you could have 100 different countries, 100 different sites all around the world, from Africa to the Western developed world. China also contributed to some of these platform data also. But also, I think one of the important components of this is harmonizing between different studies and between different platforms that originally had different questions they were answering, but trying to merge the two was extremely important to get some of the answers very quickly from different sites. And I think this is an important tool. It's a technique that we probably need to continue to focus on. I'm really excited about seeing some of the data when we get some of the word on VLU with this type of platforms, because we see so much of that, and we seem to be seeing more of it every day, quite frankly. Every week we're seeing patients who are coming in with VLUs that are open for years. Yep. And some of them are post-lipidic, some of them are not. We have a large need for study in this patient population, because I do feel, and I agree with you, that the treatments that we have are suboptimal. So best of luck with the next trial. Do you know where you'll be sending this next? Where's the next step for this? You said international collaboration would be a way to go. Which organizations, what platform?
We're currently considering a couple of funding options. Certainly, there's one that is a potential collaboration with, so it's a specific call for projects in collaboration with Australia. So I think what's the important thing is, for this case, I mean, certainly it'd be nice to just get it funded so it can start. I think an absolute benefit would be to make it as international as possible, because one of the big fallacies that we certainly have in our data is that we have very little data on other types of ethnicities of patients from different countries. All of the data, if you look at it, is really Western Europe, US, and the vast majority of patients who are recruited to the VLU studies are by large, Caucasian with very, single type of ethnicity. And we know not only in venous research, but across the board, that involving different ethnic groups to participate in research is very difficult. And there are barriers that we need to try and overcome so that we are able to recruit these patients, because we don't know what the outcomes are, because we just have no data. And actually being able to recruit patients to such a study from Africa, from the Middle East, from the Far East would be incredibly helpful to be able to determine whether there are any differences in outcomes in different countries and why that might be. Because I agree with you, the issue with non-healing and high recurrence rates, I think, is across the board. It's not just a problem that is found in England or in the US. And just going to your point from before, is absolutely, this is a more cost-effective way of doing things, particularly because you need to recruit less patients. Because you have a single control group, you don't have to duplicate the control group for every single arm. You just have one control group, and therefore you have to recruit less patients, but also because of the statistics that you use and the modeling that you use, you can determine effects at a smaller number of patients recruited. So it's a very cost-effective way to be able to perform such studies, which, as you know, are extremely expensive and are in the region of the millions when you're trying to get even just a single comparative randomized controlled trial funded. And that's very difficult, particularly in this climate. So actually trying to get a more cost-effective way of doing it, I think, would be really beneficial. And as a whole, I think the venous leg ulcer population is perfect for it, because you can look at healing rates, but once they've healed, they can then be randomized in recurrence prevention trials. And so it can be very dynamic and would be able to help, the whole C5 and C6 group as a whole, in a way, as opposed to just concentrating on one group. So there's still a lot of work to do, and we need to try and figure a way of funding it in the first place. But I think it's really exciting, and hopefully that will, be something that, in a few years' time, we'll be able to say that is one of the ways that we can collaborate and perform further high-quality trials for our patients.
Thank you so much. This is really, really exciting work, and thank you for sharing it. I think it'll really be an important contribution to people who are interested in this type of research. I was really impressed with the flexibility of these studies, that as they finished one arm, they actually took that data and added into another arm and were able to change some of the trials on the fly, so to speak. And that really made a lot of difference in terms of getting some of the results out quickly. So thank you very much for sharing this exciting new innovative technology. I think it's going to be very, very important, not only just in VLUs, but lots of other vascular diseases.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.